and then you can just take that link and post it.
Okay, great. All right, so we are recording, and this is the kickoff meeting for this production readiness group for SIG architecture on Kubernetes. It's October 8th, 2019. And thank you, everybody, for joining. Please put your name in the attendee list so that we know who's involved here. If possible, if there's anybody who could take notes, otherwise I can try to take notes. I'll just give a quick intro and then we can maybe talk about who people are. I think some of us know each other, but not everybody. As far as the goal of this project is just to try to raise the bar on what we are delivering in Kubernetes in the open source project, and ensure sort of the rapid growth stage of the project. Well, we're still maybe growing quickly, but at some point you have to hit a level of maturity where people are really depending on this, obviously in many production environments, and we have to be really careful about what gets rolled out. So the idea is to try and introduce some of the process and gates that would help us make sure that that's true. I'm John Bellameric. I have a cap out there, which is sort of along with Vish, who some of you may know, who's not here. He's on leave right now, but coming back soon. He and I were talking here with another person at Google about how we might do this, and that's where the cap came from. So hoping to get people's feedback and see where we can take this. I guess on my, I'll maybe ask for intros from people based on where they're listed in my Zoom. So Jed, actually, Jared, you're up next, I guess.
Yeah, hi, I'm Jared Dillon. I'm an engineer over at D2IQ, and I'm the developer on the Kudo project. So mostly been interested lately in controller runtime and SIG API machinery. Jason and I just talked at last KubeCon, and we've been talking ever since about doing some more work over in SIG architecture. And with everything going on now, it seemed like a great time to make that time. So
great, excellent. Quentin.
Hi, yeah, I similarly kind of looking for places where I can assist. I was a former SRE at Google and put a lot of the production readiness review stuff in place internally in Google. And yeah, happy to help here if I can be of help.
Sounds like you would be. Alejandro?
Hi everyone, my name is Jorge Larcon. I'm an engineer, a big Kubernetes fan that turned into a contributor, and just wanted to jump in and see if I could help out this project.
Great, Valerie.
Hi everyone, I'm an engineer at Lyft on the compute platform team. I contribute to a lot of kind of scattered stuff upstream, and I'm hoping to move more into Arch in particular. I'm not sure if this is the project I'm necessarily going to attach to, but I definitely want to help make sure that it happens.
Great. Jed?
Hi, I'm Jed Salazar. I'm a customer reliability engineer at VMware. Was part of the Heptio acquisition prior to that. And we support customers running production clusters. And I've been an SRE internally at Google in the past, so this seemed like a pretty good project to contribute to.
Great, thank you. And I think I have Dims and Jordan still. So Dims, go ahead.
Hi, my nickname is Dims. I work at VMware. I just wanted to see how this initial meeting goes, and I might be able to assist as well. I don't know that much about the production readiness part as such, but I'm hoping to learn. Thank you.
Okay, and Jordan?
Hey, Jordan Leggett. I work at Google. Been with the project for a while and have kind of been involved in a lot of different aspects of bringing features to GA status, and would like to see that be made more consistent and take the learnings from some areas that we think were done really well and help make that more consistent.
All right. Well, Jordan is overly humble. He's everywhere all the time. Um, so awesome. Thank you, everybody. So I guess we can start maybe just by looking at the CAP a little bit. But what the goal of this meeting is just to kick off, kind of get the ball rolling, see who wants to contribute, and talk about a little bit about how we want to scope the work as far as whether it's, we're just going to focus on this CAP, in which case there's no sort of further organization other than just the people working on it, or whether we think that there's a general class of problem that we're trying to solve here, and this is just one instance of it that we've got additional sort of ongoing work and effort, and want either a sub project, or if we're going, if it's going to disband after a while and it's cross SIG, then maybe a working group. But I wanted to get people's thoughts on that. Two of the things that I thought are somewhat related or adjacent in some way are the alpha, beta, and GA criteria, and the CAP that was recently that was recently submitted around beta transition policy. So this is around how we maintain the code and project system health, kind of prevent code rot, that sort of thing. Jumping in specifically to this CAP, looking at, as I mentioned in the sort of intro, really just thinking about the place that Kubernetes is now in its life cycle. We need maybe some more discipline in how we release features. And so wanted to put together get a consensus on what we consider production readiness criteria for the different phases of features, come up with some sort of gate. And Jordan suggested, I talked to him in the past, which I think is a great suggestion of, using existing Pro tooling around this potentially, rather than sort of a human process in, sort of overall checklist, but actually implementing that into tooling. So that's the other goal there. If possible, I want to avoid like brand new tooling. I want to use the existing tooling that we have. And those are my goals around it. And I guess I'm looking for feedback and thoughts. I did have a proposal here, initial proposal, document them, obviously document what the criteria are, come up with a questionnaire. And the tooling aspect of this would be that each of these questions in the questionnaire would be able to be, would essentially, one, we'd look if there's tooling that can evaluate whether that question is true or not, or answered properly or not, without any additional human input. Otherwise, it could be like somebody entering a line in a file somewhere that describes something about the answer to this question, and the relevant SIG or relevant people would approve that sort of thing. So any thoughts or comments?
I'm just curious, do we see any cluster operator or this kind of trickling down to a human at some point within the scope of this, or is this kind of purely tooling for the software before it's released to the upstream?
You're saying, how does this relate to the post? I mean, I think the criteria involved are going to be written by people, hopefully on this call, who have a lot of experience running these clusters. But some of the questions are things like, can this feature be disabled in production? Which certainly in a beta phase or an alpha phase, you need that ability, right? I mean, I think that we already have that policy in place captured somewhere, but whether we have any sort of enforcement of that or tooling around it, I'm not sure.
Yeah, the beta thing, especially, like is this feature required to start up a cluster? And if it's required at beta level, that's concerning. That probably means it's like there's a mismatch between how stable it actually is and how stable things building on top of it expect it to be. So that's a really key one. That's not actually something we enforce today. I would like to see our conformance tests run with no beta APIs enabled.
Yeah.
There are some, and this, like you said, this ties into the other proposal that is trying to avoid permanent beta APIs that just languish and don't get stabilized. So things like CSR, things like ingress, those are a couple of the ones that pretty much all clusters use today and are still considered beta. And so that CAP is trying to avoid introducing new things like that so we can work on stabilizing the ones we have. I think this would tie into that as well. Like if you're wanting to promote a feature to beta, you should need to answer the question, is this required to, like, can you bring up a cluster without this turned on?
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
One piece of feedback I had for this proposal, and I was thinking in context of the CRD v1 stabilization that happened in 1.16. And there was some performance work that went into that during the v1 beta 1 phase. And what there's a bunch of post GA work as well there that's ongoing. And that was I guess the specific thought I had around with that was the establishment of like SLAs and SLOs around the behavior of v1 beta 1. Sorry, muted. Performance is mentioned a little bit in this CAP, but I guess my question would be in this production readiness, and maybe something we could either automate or may require a human, is at what point is something expected behavior versus having to open an issue for and being treated as either a regression or a bug in the system, specific to those. And I specifically look at that because at CRD v1, because the GA for the work for that included SLAs and SLOs. So I'm not sure if that fits under this existing monitoring requirements or something that we want to capture here, but it is, I think, important in stabilizing something from beta to GA.
Yeah, I mean, we did talk. So let me clarify that this proposal is part of the process here is I want to develop this checklist. This is not the complete checklist, right? In the CAP, this is the example of here's some of the things we would consider. But if we feel that this CAP is something we want to move forward with, which I'm getting the feeling at least the people on this call think so, then part of that would be defining that checklist, which would be something everybody contributes to, I think, and that would become a special, that would become a separate document within the repository. But then additionally, along with that, we would implement some sort of process to ensure that those questions are answered, that the playbooks are available, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I think definitely SLIs and SLOs are important. I guess you're trying to say is if we define these SLOs in this process, does that mean that if we're not meeting those SLOs in some production environment, we raise an issue, or in some test environment, maybe more achievably, as less is more.
Yeah. What happens post graduation, right? Or post production ready?
So I think there are two kind of dimensions there. One is changes to existing features and needing to understand, like, I've got this GA feature in use in my cluster. I don't have the option to disable it or cut off access to it. And now, like in a new release, a thing is happening to it, like some new feature, some new field, some new whatever. Is this going to regress performance? And that's a really hard question to answer if you don't have SLOs or SLAs defined for it in the first place. It's like, did we regress performance? Like, I don't know, seems pretty fast for me. And so, like, before you can start having conversations about post GA, like, what does V2 look like? Oh, we're going to go do these things. Like, you need to have defined, like what performance do we recommend and guarantee, and have that documented. And then when you go to make those changes, if you're changing an API that already exists, that people are already using, that's already GA, you can have a bar to measure things against and say, okay, we added these new features and we are still within the previously specified SLO, SLA. For brand new things, like, hey, here's a new API that no one has used before. It's newly beta, newly GA. Like, to me, it's making sure you define those things so you're setting expectations correctly. And someone who's going to go build on top of this thing we say is stable can know whether they're doing something crazy because we said you can have 10,000 of these and they want to make 10 million of them. Right. It's all about setting expectations and having a thing that we can measure to make sure we're not regressing those expectations.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know, like, when we did Core DNS, we had no information about whether it was like, what are our GA criteria? I have no idea because I don't know how this current system behaves, right? So I can't say whether we're better or worse very easily. And even our testing, when we did finally come up with some things, the testing that's there in the existing scalability suite really only tested a very narrow slice of what we needed to test in order to have confidence that what we were replacing it with was at least as good, if not better. And I think that this effort, putting SLIs and SLOs in, or at least SLIs that we can measure in place for every feature, means that we have some criteria by which to judge a given change.
Do we have a sense of where the big problems lie here? I don't personally, I don't operate a lot of these clusters and do the upgrades and things. Do we have a sort of a communally accepted set of known problems today? Like, do we get a lot of performance regressions? Where are the big problems to solve here? Because it strikes me that the scope here is very large, and we could go around chasing theoretical problems for a very long time and not necessarily address the real practical ones that people are running into regularly.
I think that's a great question. I don't have an answer offhand. I mean, one of the other folks involved here is on our SRE team, so I would be pulling in those folks to have the experience, to try to bring the experience of running tens of thousands of clusters into that and informing it. But I know we have other people who are operating clusters here, and so I'd love to hear from them right now.
So I can speak somewhat to that, probably more conjecturally than I'd like. I can probably come back, maybe next meeting with some scrub data. But, the primary challenge that we see really is just, users keeping up with the upgrade cadence and keeping up to date with clusters and kind of languishing with, beta features that have graduated and become stable, but due to lack of staffing or operational resources being able to actually utilize them. I know that that's orthogonal to this discussion. I'll try to come up with something next time that is a little bit more meaty from the tech side. But overall, the rollback is something that we consider to be somewhat problematic, like, in-place upgrades for a Kubernetes cluster. Those fail. Rollback is particularly challenging. We've, kind of adopted or sometimes recommend a mutable, type of upgrade where you just basically throw machines at it and have them join the cluster via kubeadm or something like that to avoid some of those pitfalls. But I'll come back next time with some better data on that front.
Okay, I mean, yeah, like I said, this is more of a kickoff to try and organize the effort as opposed to make substantial progress on it itself. Along those lines, we've kind of drilled into the discussion a little bit. Jordan, it looked like you were going to say something, or is that my imagination? Okay, so maybe we should back up a little bit and sort of have that discussion, like, right, to me, this is actually the main thing I wanted to get out of this call is how we're going to organize this going forward so that we can just sort of make progress on it. Do others think that these adjacent items are within scope of some group? Like, do we need to define a subgroup of SIG architecture, in this case, to manage and sort of shepherd through these kinds of efforts? Or do we think that's just unnecessary extra overhead? And we should just treat them as individual efforts going forward. Any thoughts on that?
I suspect that having people in charge of making sure it happens would help, but I'm not sure if that needs to be a fully dedicated group or not.
There may even be some like information discovery. I put some thoughts in the chat as well, like and to go bounce off what Valerie said, maybe the first step is to gather information, and as we advance this CAP, and if there's ongoing work around, like one of the things I listed there was figuring out what features are failing to thrive or failing to advance through this process, and could use that help, and what help they need, I think might help define if an ongoing sub-project's necessary.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. If we have known problem areas, it sort of gets back to what I said earlier. Unless we have like concrete problems we're trying to solve here, we could, struggle to focus on the right things.
So if you're looking for a problem, cron job is a problem, I think.
Well, I think that where these come together, the beta transition policy, and this CAP that's the subject of this call initially is that we don't want the transition policy to push things to go to GA before they're ready, just because they're going to time out. So, James, I think you're saying like cron job is something, it's another one of these that's lingered. Is that correct?
That's right.
Yeah, and that one actually has specific performance and scale issues that are known, which and a few kind of feature usability things as well. But the biggest thing I know of is it's not workable to like poll all cron jobs in the system every 10 seconds and see if any need to have a job launched, which is what the controller does today. And so we don't want to just say, well, it's lingering and we need to be stable, so GA. And I don't think anyone would do that, but that's kind of the knee jerk, like, well, they've been around for years and years, let's just promote them. And so
we wound up in a de facto state with Ingress, where because it's been in the state it's been in for so long, we basically had to GA it because it was effectively GA.
Yeah, that one was a little different. It wasn't that, like, it wasn't workable. It was broadly adopted, so it clearly was workable to some extent, but it was more usability issues with that one.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, all happy APIs are the same. Every unhappy API is unhappy in its own way.
Right. Another thing that comes to mind, Valerie, you might know more about this, is IPVS versus IP tables, right? What is the trade-off there, and how do we move that? How do we get people off of IP tables and use IPVS? That would be another example, right?
Okay, so there are a number of examples we know about things that are being that have lingered or haven't quite crossed the threshold. I mean, IPVS did go to GA, right? But
right, that was an effort that was undertaken just because we knew that we needed something better than IP tables, right?
Right, but it's still not the default. It's still not, yeah.
Right. How do we make it the default and get people off of IP tables? I mean, when do we stop using IP tables, right? Can we get rid of IP tables? When can we deprecate and get rid of it. That would be part of the issue too, right?
So, Dems, I'm confused. Like, obviously, people have been running production-ready IP tables-oriented clusters for 15 or 16 releases of Kubernetes. Is the scope of this discussion about how we transition to future production states, or how we transition new maturing features into a production-ready state, or deprecating production-ready features into a non-supported state?
Yeah, I was asking that same question, Derek. We've always talked about promoting things. Like I was talking I was asking if we want to be in the business of deprecating and moving things out as well.
Sort of the whole life cycle of a feature, you're saying?
Correct. Yeah.
So some features aren't necessarily intended as replacements for other features, right? It's just like an alternative. I think of our authenticators, right? We have ones that tie into OpenID Connect, and we will have ones that tie into like authenticating proxies, and one isn't deprecating the other. But some features are intending to deprecate others, and thought needs to be given to how, like, once this is stable and mature and performant and whatever, like how would someone transition to this feature? And that's something that I think doesn't get a lot of thought necessarily. Like people just kind of assume, oh, well, when you spin up new clusters, they'll use this new thing, without really thinking about, but I have thousands of old clusters. What's going to happen to them? A lot of these, I think, are really useful to make sure the developers and designers of features are thinking about. What I want to avoid is just a checklist with a bunch of questions that the people who are supposed to answer them don't understand the reason for. And so you end up with a bunch of like very surface level or like NA doesn't apply types of answers.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe something we can, maybe giving examples, or like the reason this is important is because people running clusters are going to need to do this. So explain to this persona like how they would make sure your feature is on and working. And like, so I don't know if it's examples or kind of describing scenarios for the people who have to answer these questions.
So a general question I have is, obviously there's a variety of deployment methodologies used in the wild today for Kubernetes. Is a production readiness guide that is being documented intended to target any specific installation or deployment model? Like, you have people in the world that are running hyperscale cloud hosted solutions where control planes are run on under management cluster. You have people in the world running control planes on hosts. You have people on the world doing some variation between when you get down the nuts and bolts of it. What level of guidance are we targeting here in this group? Is it like the how to observe like a qubit log or a kube controller log or the commands for it? Or are we intending to also try to do deployment specific proxy readiness?
From my point of view, I don't necessarily want to delve into all the different ways you could possibly deploy it. I think that this is more around making sure that the features we release provide visibility, so they're actually logging, and that there's documented somewhere a playbook that says here's how you'd actually access that information. That they have SLIs that you can know that the actual you've got some metrics you can look at or something you can look at to see that it's working in production. It's not just, well, nobody's complained yet, right?
Okay.
So more generic kind of things like that pretty much any deployment mode are going to need. I don't think we want to take on the scope of trying to understand everybody's deployment mode.
Okay, so is that explicitly stated somewhere, like as we kick off this sub-project, that like we'll give no preference to a particular deployment mode?
well, we can state that. So
Because
think
I agree with you. I agree with everything you said, John. And I just want to make. I think like as we're kicking this off, like I'm wondering if we just need to like set some ground rules or
Yeah.
understanding how we want to scope it.
It reminds me a lot of the supported component SKU, like the supported versions and component SKU and upgrade order document. Like that doesn't, we worked really hard not to like pin down a particular topology because there are several in existence, but like the people writing the Kubernetes components have to know what they're expected to support as far as like n-1+1 order of operations types of things. And so the component SKU upgrade order document says like, before you upgrade your kubelet, this is what your API server has to be like. Before you upgrade your API server, this is what your controller has to look like. And that kind of is the least common denominator of, we can tell developers like, you have to make the Kubernetes components work with these setups. And then people running their own topologies and deployments and upgrades and everything, as long as you're following this guide, like if you're running it locally or remotely or like upgrading things in a batch, like it doesn't matter as long as these invariants hold. So
Okay.
something kind of along those lines.
Yeah, so that sounds good, Jordan. And then like thinking back to Dim's prior question around things like IP tables and IPVS, like that seemed to dive down into like particular operating system or kernel levels you might deploy. I assume, are we looking to dive deeper into OS specific layers or remain agnostic on that?
I think of things like service account tokens to bound service account tokens. Like that's a feature that SIG has been working on for a long time, and it's got a tricky rollout. And like I think we probably should have thought about the rollout like from the very beginning, instead of saying we can make this better and people who want to turn it on can, and then being like, well, world, come on, turn it on, it's better. That's an example of one that isn't really kernel specific. Like it's very, API server, Kubernetes feature oriented, but the rollout is still hard, and we need to think about how to get people off the old thing onto the new thing.
Yeah, and I only asked this because I think we're on the cusp of some complicated things probably, and so like Dim's from like a SIG node perspective, like I'm thinking if I see a future feature enhancement that says kubelet tolerates C groups v2, and like I'm wondering what type of production readiness guide would I author for that, and what type of migration guide, if any, would one be expecting for that? And that's probably similar to like IP tables versus IPVS type of thing. So, John, did you have particular production readiness scenarios that you felt like were at a magnitude that were worth talking through for this on? But that's basically where my question was coming from. It's just like, what would I write for C groups v2?
Yeah, basically, don't be worse than C groups v1.
It's more complicated than that.
Yeah, I know. But honestly, John, when you guys were doing the core DNS versus kube DNS, we did ask for some performance criteria that you ended up meeting, right? How was that discussion, and how did that prompt you? Because that is similar to what Derek is talking about now, right?
Right. I mean, definitely. Well, so when you're talking about something that's replacing an existing feature, I think it's actually easier, right? Because then you've got some bar that you can draw, and you know that if you can beat that bar, that what you're doing is better. I think that the thing is that at least at that time there was no list of what that bar should be. It was just more based on the judgment of the people who were working on it on the process with us, right? And what I would hope to get out of this is that we would at least have a list of things that people need to consider deeply, and the particular cases of any given feature are going to have their own peculiarities as well. But I don't know. I'm not sure that answers the question. I found that initially it was a little bit like it was initially it was that tribal open source thing where it's like, who do I have to talk to and get to convince, really, like that this is good enough, and that's in some way appropriate at what part of a project's phase, where there's people who have the whole state in their head and they're like, okay, I know what you need to do in order to convince me that this is good, that this is a good move. But it does make for too much individuals being too much part of the decision-making process, as opposed to having some kind of criteria that if that individual isn't there or can't be there anymore, there's somebody else who can make that evaluation.
Right.
So I guess from that point of view, one, having the upfront list of, okay, here's what we need to work on if we want to achieve this, and two, you know, I know that you know, I still have to convince certain individuals because there's people who are in that position in the project. That's what their job is, but nonetheless, at least I have some rubric against which to judge what I'm doing, whether it's good enough.
Yeah, the KEP has questions that hint at some of these areas, like what are the upgrade and downgrade implications of your feature? And there's like an ocean of potential issues there. And like you said, there are people with the state of the system in their heads. And like if we look at rollout of some of these features, like there are really good lessons to be learned, and like for the, you know, oh yeah, your controller has to work with kubelets current version back to 2 levels old, and like the implications of that. And so Quentin, you say that the scope of this seems very large. I think it's like limitless if we took it to the nth degree, but if we did like a breadth first rather than a depth first version, and just kind of took some of the really broad questions in the KEP template and asked specific questions like, are you changing the controller? Can you work with kubelets up to 2 versions older than you? Like just questions that the people who are answering those and filling those out might not even be aware of today. I think we can improve awareness, at least, of the types of things that features need to consider as a first pass.
So that seems to indicate, Jordan, that we need to serve as a watering hole to get the people who are bringing in KEPs. And going back to what John was saying, that I didn't know who we need to talk to. Like we serve as the flashpoint where, you know, these people, we line up some KEPs, we line up some people who know the area really well. Like if there's a networking stuff, then make sure that Tim is around, or, you know, bring people in and do that for some time. Is that what you're thinking? Or would that help to start?
I think anything would help, honestly. Like taking specific examples, historical examples, case studies, things that went well, things that didn't go well, I think would be a good way to collect a lot of information. The key is taking all that information and then like summarizing it or making it actionable and useful for the people who are working on the current crop of features that are going to cause us headaches. Not us, but like people who run upgrades headaches tomorrow.
I think that the watering hole idea is a very valuable thing. And if that's all that comes out of this, I think that is valuable, so having a common place for people to come and learn about these things. I can't help thinking that unless we have some kind of metric for saying, is that having the desired effect? Are we having, you know, less features stuck in beta, or are we having less upgrade problems, or are we having, you know, whatever? we won't know how effective that is.
Yeah. Quentin, the problem there is another set of problems about you were talking about making progress, right? It's more because there isn't enough people working on the issue. Like you take cron job, like nobody wants to touch it right now. Nobody's interested in that. So I don't know how we can make progress there when there is nobody active working on it, right?
Well, that actually I think is interesting because the beta timeout deadline I think forces that, right? Either there's somebody who's interested in that functionality and has customers who are interested in that functionality and they're willing to support it and push it forward, or there aren't. And if there aren't, then let's get rid of it, right? And if there aren't, if they're important enough to those people, they're gonna have to pick it up.
And just to point out, like there is activity on cron job. There's a KEP that is trying to enumerate the remaining issues and starting to work through them. I think my concern is more that we will not learn lessons from past mistakes, and that we're not asking the questions that need to be asked to even understand if a design is ready to go implement. Like there's this rush to a rush to go get things in implementable at the feature freeze deadline for every release, and there's not a crisp. There's not always some features are better than others. There's not always a crisp vision of, have you thought through how we're going to upgrade this and how we're going to roll it out and what the implications are for clusters that don't have this feature, and like getting clear answers to those things seems really useful.
Sorry, what you're talking about is actually at design time, not even at like, right? So there's the set of questions that need to be asked at design time, and then there's a sort of hopefully rubber stamping that needs to be done at a promotion time to say, yeah, we actually fulfilled those and the other criteria. Oh, go ahead, Valerie. I didn't see.
Would it potentially be valuable to take a cross section of features where this has been a bit bumpy, like cron job is a pretty good example, and dig into a postmortem of some of the design decisions and why it got out the door and kind of why it happened the way it did?
Yeah, I was about to suggest exactly the same. I'm sure we must have postmortems for some of these things, right? I mean, GKE and these people must have postmortems of some stuff. Is that what you're essentially looking for? Is like
not as much an outage thing as like this thing went poorly or we wish it had gone better. Let's look at what kind of oversight or trade-offs were made that made that happen so we can learn from it. Because I feel like we're talking very abstract here.
Sure.
Yeah,
No, the postmortem I was referring to was not necessarily, you know, a big outage, but something that went poorly, and therefore we want to understand exactly what caused it and what the things we'll do differently next time.
I think we're talking about their development process as opposed to production readiness, and I'm afraid we're scope creeping here. I mean, it's related, obviously. Okay.
I don't know. I think it's easier to ask these questions like in the design phase than it is to say like, we're ready to promote to beta, we're ready to promote to GA. Can we have, you know, a +1 on our PR? And then we're like, wait, does the scale, can you upgrade it? Like, maybe you should fundamentally rethink your design. Like that's a really awkward point to be asking these questions. To your question, Valerie, I think postmortems or like thinking about how the process could have been better is a really good thing to do. Things like cron job were started so long ago, like the design and development process that was followed to run those bears almost no resemblance to our current one. So I'm not sure how useful that particular one would be for like informing what tweaks we want to make to our current process.
In that case, the questions might be more like, why are we still having this problem? Why are we not picking it up? But yeah, I'm just thinking maybe if we look at some more specific things, we might have a better idea of what the rakes in the grass are.
Right. What I was thinking, Valerie, was we need to leave a body of work for other people who are coming next, right? So what do we leave as artifacts that from this group that would be useful for the next set of people who will be doing this, right? Just now when we were talking about CodeDNS, I went and looked at what John had filed for the GA, CodeDNS stuff. And then I said, okay, fine, there's a set of questions that people asked, and this is a set of questions they were asking for this kind of an issue, right? So when we are doing something with a specific KEP, should we write it down as this was the set of questions we asked, and then these were the responses that we got? Would that be like useful? Is that the set of things that's going to be useful for the next bunch of people to get an idea of, okay, how did some problem happen, or how did we guide somebody through a specific KEP?
So what are the questions we've asked in the past during design reviews, during reviews of promotions? I think those are, I think those are valuable things. Do we have for, say, API conventions, right? I guess we don't have anything around, other than what's in the KEP template, much around like what are questions we want answered by a design.
So one thing, John, that I know I would value, maybe others would too, is right now our KEP process when you're designing a feature doesn't give you much insight into the metrics I use to monitor that feature in production. Very rarely can I go back at a KEP and see that this is what I want to add to my monitoring or alerting on is this thing working or not. Mm-hmm. Speaking for me, at least here at Red Hat, like we would find that immensely useful, and I know we depend on the work of the overall cluster monitoring efforts that's happening across the community to help make that better. But I think like that's a key part of like production readiness to me, is like, can I monitor it to know if it's healthy or not? Mm-hmm. And just enumerating the set of metrics that your feature added or did not add and why would be a really useful first step. Because sometimes these things come in and then there's like a second pass that gets them either exposed in cube state metrics or gets them actually crawled afterwards by the broader monitoring community, that sometimes features find their way in production before you actually knew how to monitor them.
And I think people give some thought to failure modes when they're designing them, because you'll see them in design docs. Like, here's the flow of my controller, and if I encounter this, then I'll do this. And then if I encounter that, then I'll retry, and then I'll back off. And like, there is thought given to that, but taking it that final step and saying, and here's how you know if this is happening. Like this, here's the name of the metric, and it's a gauge or histogram or whatever. Like, if you want to monitor for this, do this. Would be really useful.
So I think that what this brings up is sort of like, where is the appropriate place to document all this? Like, is everything going to be in the KEP, or do we have a separate playbook that contains the operational aspects? Like the KEP right now, it's got the design in there supposedly, right? It's got a lot of stuff in there, and is that and then I don't know, is that the right place to keep all of that? It's not. I can see pros and cons both ways. But does it stay? What my observation is that KEPs are not maintained. And so, I mean, they don't even flip the state from like implementable to implemented, like much less maintain them over time as the feature evolves. Yeah, I guess people are, we only have about 2 minutes left. So I guess what are our next steps here? We didn't really answer the question. I think Derek, you may have joined a few minutes late. One of the questions I had was how we want to organize this effort and what kind of scope we want to give it. I feel like we've, if anything, added scope. And do we want to just, for now, continue as an amorphous group that doesn't necessarily have a sub-project or a working group title, or do we think there's a need for that kind of thing? or just decide later. At this point, I would say the next action item is, I don't know, try to synthesize some of these notes and ideas and have another call, but I don't want to waste people's time. I want to make sure we're focused in moving forward with some list of deliverables. So comments on the CAP would be helpful.
I think we can probably coordinate in SIG mailing list thread and the document that's open, the CAP. I like starting with a bunch of questions that operators would have, and then figuring out like whether we have the information to answer those questions, and if not, how we want to go about gathering. But starting with like the people who run clusters, what questions do they have? Big long list of those, and that's something we can go out and like solicit from people who run clusters. That would be really helpful.
Right, and just so we have something solid to go by, right? Can we pick like 2 CAPs that is in progress for 117 and talk about them next time?
Those poor CAPs, they're going to have us descend on them.
Valerie, I think you wanted to say something.
Oh, I was just waving at the people who run Kubernetes comment.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you. I guess I'll start a discussion on the mailing list again and point people to the CAP and the recording and try to give some sort of synopsis here. So thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thanks, John.